The envelope trembled in Catherine's hands, its edges soft from her nervous fingers tracing the same path over and over. The ink had smeared where her tears had fallen 3 days ago when she first discovered it hidden beneath the loose floorboard in their bedroom. Now she stood by the kitchen window, morning light filtering through the lace curtains she had sewn with such hope 6 months ago, watching her husband Thomas split wood in the yard with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. His shoulders moved beneath the worn cotton of his shirt, each swing of the axe sending splinters flying like tiny prayers into the autumn air. He had no idea she knew, no suggestion that the letter she held contained words that would change everything between them, words that explained the careful way he avoided anything written, the way his eyes would cloud when she read aloud from the newspaper, the way he always found excuses to leave when she pulled out her books. The letter was addressed to her, appreciating her, but it wasn't meant for her eyes. It was meant for Thomas, written in a woman's careful script, signed with love from someone called Margaret. Catherine had found it by accident, reaching for her hairbrush that had rolled beneath the loose board, in the shock of discovering her husband's secret correspondence had nearly stopped her heart. But it wasn't what she expected. It wasn't a love affair or a hidden past that would destroy their fragile marriage. It was something else entirely, something that made her chest ache, with a tenderness she hadn't known she possessed. The letter was simple, written in large, careful letters, as if by someone teaching a child to write. It read, "Dear Thomas, I hope this finds you well. I have been practicing my letters as you asked. The word of the day is happiness. It has 2 P's and 2 S's. I think of you when I write it. Your sister Margaret." Catherine closed her eyes, the truth washing over her like cold creek water. Her husband, the man who had answered her advertisement for a bride with such eloquent letters that had moved her heart, could not read, could not write. Someone else had written those letters for him. Someone else had captured the longing and hope that had drawn her across 3 states to marry a stranger. The deception should have angered her, should have broken whatever trust they had built in their quiet months together. Instead, it broke her heart for entirely different reasons. She thought of all the times he had watched her with such careful attention when she read, the way his hands would still on whatever task they were doing, the way he seemed to drink in every word like a man dying of thirst. She thought of the shame he must carry, the fear that she would discover his secret and find him wanting, the shame she knew too well herself, the same shame that had driven her from Boston after the scandal that had ruined her reputation and left her with no choice but to answer a stranger's advertisement for a wife. They were both hiding, both carrying secrets that felt too heavy to bear alone. The wood split and stopped. Catherine quickly folded the letter and tucked it into her apron pocket, then turned back to the stove, where oatmeal bubbled in the iron pot. Thomas would come in soon, wash his hands at the basin, and sit at the table they had built together, where he would eat his breakfast in the comfortable silence that had become their morning ritual. He would thank her quietly, would kiss her forehead with the careful tenderness of a man afraid to want too much, and would head out to tend the fence line that seemed to need constant mending. And she would watch him go, her heart full of words she didn't know how to say, full of a love that had grown slowly and surely in the space between their careful politeness and the deeper understanding that was just beginning to bloom. Today, she decided, would be different. Today, she would find a way to tell him that his secret was safe with her, that she understood what it meant to hide parts of yourself from the world, that love could grow in the spaces between what was said and what was felt. The door opened and Thomas stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of pine and autumn air. His dark hair was damp with sweat, his hands already reaching for the towel she had left beside the basin. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of his German childhood, the voice that had become as familiar to her as her breathing. "Good morning," she replied, ladling oatmeal into his bowl, adding the honey she had learned he preferred. They sat across from each other as they always did, the morning sun casting long shadows across the pine table. But today, Catherine watched him differently, noticed the way his eyes carefully avoided the newspaper folded beside his plate, the way his fingers drummed nervously against his coffee cup when she cleared her throat as if to speak. She saw him, really saw him, for the first time since their wedding day, saw the intelligence in his dark eyes, the kindness in the set of his mouth, the careful way he had built their life together with his hands and his heart, even if he couldn't make it with words on paper. Saw the man who had been gentle with her fears, patient with her secrets, who had never once pressed her for more than she was ready to give. The man who had placed a practical advertisement with what she now knew were borrowed words, but who had lived up to every promise those words had made. "Thomas," she said softly, setting down her spoon. He looked up, and she saw something flicker in his expression, a wariness that made her heart ache. "There was something I wanted to tell you," she continued, watching as his shoulders tensed slightly. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What is it, Catherine?" Her name on his lips still sent warmth through her chest, the way he said it like something precious, something to be handled with care. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the letter, placing it gently on the table between them. Thomas went very still, the color draining from his face as he recognized the familiar handwriting, his hands clenched into fists on his thighs, and she saw the shame wash over him like a tide, saw him preparing to retreat into the careful distance he maintained when he felt exposed. "I found it by accident," she said quickly, her voice gentle. "I wasn't searching through your things. The floorboard was loose, and my brush rolled underneath, and I just—" She trailed off, watching as he closed his eyes, his jaw working with some internal struggle. "I know what you're thinking," she continued, reaching across the table to cover one of his clenched fists with her small hand. "But you're wrong." He opened his eyes then, and she saw fear there, raw and vulnerable. The fear of a man who had been judged and found wanting before, who had learned to hide rather than risk the shame of exposure. "I don't care that you can't read, Thomas. I care that you felt you had to hide it from me. I care that you've been carrying this alone." His hand unclenched beneath hers, his fingers trembling slightly as they turned to intertwine with hers. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of words neither knew how to say. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I wanted to be the man who wrote those letters to you, wanted to be worthy of the woman who answered them." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding flooding through her like sunrise after a long night. She thought of her own deception, Her own carefully crafted letters that had painted her as a simple country girl seeking a quiet life. Letters that had hidden the scandal that had driven her from polite society. The broken engagement and whispered accusations that had made her name poison in Boston drawing rooms. "We all want to be worthy of love," she said softly. "But maybe worthiness isn't about perfection. Perhaps it's about what we do with the truth once we find the courage to share it." Thomas stared at her, something shifting in his expression, hope beginning to replace the fear. She squeezed his hand gently, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I can teach you if you want. To read, to write. We could start with simple words and work our way up to longer ones. And in return," she paused, gathering her courage, knowing that her truth was just as risky as his. "In return, perhaps you could help me learn how to trust again, how to believe that someone could know the worst parts of me and still choose to stay." The morning light had shifted, painting golden squares across the pine floor, warming the air between them until it felt like a blessing. Thomas lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving her face. "I would like that very much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Both parts. They sat in the quiet kitchen, hands linked across the table that had witnessed so many careful mornings, but this morning felt different. Felt like a beginning rather than a continuation. The letter lay between them, no longer a symbol of shame, but a bridge to something deeper, something more honest than either had dared hope for when they had first agreed to build a life together. Outside, the wind stirred the last leaves from the oak tree, sending them spinning past the window like tiny dancers celebrating the changing of the seasons. Inside, two people who had found each other through necessity began to discover that they might have seen something far more precious than security in their carefully arranged lives. They had found the courage to be truly known and the grace to love what they discovered. That afternoon, Catherine pulled out a child's primer she had brought from Boston. Its pages yellowed with age, but its simple words perfect for their purpose. They sat side by side on the porch bench Thomas had built during their first month together, the autumn sun warm on their backs, the book open between them like a promise. Catherine pointed to the first word, her finger tracing beneath the letters as she spoke. "This is Cat," she said, her voice patient and encouraging. Thomas studied the shapes of the letters with the same focused attention he brought to examining a piece of wood before cutting it, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had removed his hat, and the afternoon light caught the silver threads that had begun to appear at his temples, making him look distinguished rather than old. "Cat," he repeated slowly, his finger following the path hers had taken. "The sea makes a complex sound, like the beginning of come, like calling the barn cats for milk." "Yes," Catherine said, smiling at the way he connected the abstract letters to the concrete world he knew so well. "Exactly like that." They worked through the primer slowly, Thomas's deep voice carefully forming each word, Catherine's gentle corrections guiding him through the unfamiliar territory of written language. His hands, so sure when they held an axe or guided a plow, trembled slightly when they held the pencil she had given him to practice writing the letters. But he persevered with the same stubborn determination she had seen him apply to every task around their homestead, and gradually the shaking stopped, replaced by the careful, deliberate movements of a man learning to create something new. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Thomas closed the primer and turned to look at Catherine. His dark eyes were warm with gratitude and something deeper, something that made her catch her breath in her throat. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything he couldn't yet put into writing. "For not making me feel ashamed. For seeing something worth teaching." Catherine felt her cheeks warm under his gaze, her heart beating faster at the intimacy of the moment. It wasn't just the lesson they had shared, but the trust, the willingness to be vulnerable with each other that had created something entirely new between them, something that felt dangerously close to love. "You're a good student," she said softly, her voice catching slightly. "Better than many I taught back in Boston." The mention of her past hung in the air between them, a reminder that she, too, had secrets, stories that remained untold. Thomas studied her face with the same careful attention he had given to the letters in the primer, reading the shadows that crossed her expression, even though she tried to hide them. "What did you teach in Boston?" he asked gently, and she heard no judgment in his voice, only curiosity, and the same patient kindness he had shown her since the day she had stepped off the train 6 months ago. Catherine's hands twisted in her lap, the familiar shame rising in her throat like bile. She had never told anyone the whole truth, had let people assume what they would when she left so suddenly, when her engagement had been broken so wholly and publicly. But sitting here with Thomas, with the man who had just trusted her with his most profound shame, she felt the wall she had built around her past beginning to crumble. "I taught at a young ladies' academy," she said slowly, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. "I loved it. Loved watching young minds discover the power of words, the way books could open up worlds they had never imagined. I thought I would teach there for years, maybe decades. Thought I had found my place in the world." She paused, gathering courage, feeling Thomas' patient attention like a warm blanket around her shoulders. "But then I fell in love with the wrong man. A married man who promised he would leave his wife, who filled my head with dreams of a future that could never exist. When his wife discovered our correspondence, when the scandal broke," her voice cracked, the old pain still sharp after all these months, "I lost everything. My position, my reputation, my place in society. No respectable family would hire a woman who had been involved in such a scandal, even though nothing improper had happened between us. The letters were enough to destroy me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her profile as she stared out at the darkening sky. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, free of the judgment she had feared. "So we both know what it means to be marked by letters, by words that can lift us or tear us down." Catherine turned to look at him, surprised by the simple wisdom in his observation. "Yes," she said softly, "I suppose we do." "That's why you came west," he said. Not a question, but a statement of understanding. "To start over, where no one knew your story, just like me." She nodded, feeling down to him, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest beginning to ease. "Just like you." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged one by one, the night sounds of their homestead beginning around them. The creek babbled softly in the distance, night birds called from the oak tree, and somewhere in the barn, one of the cows lowed gently to her calf. It was peaceful, domestic, nothing like the constant noise and judgment of Boston society. Nothing like the life Catherine had thought she wanted before she discovered how quickly that world could turn against her. "I'm glad you came," Thomas said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "Glad that your pain brought you to me, even though I wish you had never had to experience it." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple acceptance in his words. No one had ever acknowledged her pain without also condemning her choices, without making her feel that she had brought her suffering upon herself through moral failing. But Thomas saw her clearly, saw the woman who had been hurt rather than the woman who had made mistakes. And his compassion unlocked something in her heart that had been frozen since the day she had been forced to leave Boston in disgrace. "I'm glad too," she whispered, reaching for his hand in the darkness. "Glad that we found each other, even if it happened in ways we never expected." They walked back to the house hand in hand, the primer tucked under Catherine's arm, both of them changed by the day's revelations. The kitchen felt different when they entered it, warmer somehow, filled with the possibility of honesty and the promise of deeper understanding. As they prepared for bed, moving around each other with the careful choreography of a couple still learning to share space, Catherine felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since childhood. A sense of belonging that had nothing to do with social position or reputation, and everything to do with being truly seen and accepted by another human being. Thomas paused at the threshold of their bedroom, his hand on the door frame, his expression uncertain. "Catherine," he said softly, "there's something else I need to tell you. Something I should have said a long time ago." She set down her brush, turning to face him fully, her heart beating faster at the serious tone in his voice. "What is it?" He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with careful deliberation. "When I wrote to you, when my sister helped me write those letters, I told you I was looking for a wife, someone to help build a life together. But I didn't tell you that I was also looking for love. Real love, not just companionship or convenience." Catherine's breath caught in her throat, the honesty in his words hitting her like a physical blow. She had assumed their marriage would remain practical, friendly, but distant, built on mutual benefit rather than genuine feeling. The possibility that he might want more, might be hoping for something deeper, terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I didn't know if it was possible to find that with a stranger," he continued, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "But today, sitting with you, learning from you, seeing the way you looked at me when you knew my secret, I think it might be. I think we might be." The space between them seemed charged with possibility, weighed down by the weight of everything they had shared, and everything they might become. Catherine took a step toward him, her hands trembling with the magnitude of what he was offering, what they were both risking. "I think so too," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "I've been afraid to hope for it, afraid to want more than safety and security. But when I watch you work, when I see how gentle you are with the animals, how patient you've been with my own fears and hesitations." She paused, gathering courage for the truth that had been growing in her heart for weeks. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Thomas. The real you. Not the man who wrote those perfect letters, but the man who splits wood and mends fences and now trusts me enough to let me teach him to read. Thomas crossed the room in 3 long strides, cupping her face in his work-roughened hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had begun to fall. "Catherine," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "May I kiss you? Not as a husband claiming his rights, but as a man who loves you, asking for your gift." She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat, and when his lips touched hers, it was nothing like the careful, respectful kiss they had shared on their wedding day. This kiss was full of longing and relief, of acceptance and promise, of 2 people who had found in each other not just safety but the possibility of joy. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face as if she were something precious beyond measure. "I love you," he said, the words coming easier than any he had ever spoken. "I love your strength and your gentleness and the way you see the best in everything, even in a man who can barely write his own name." Catherine laughed through her tears, her hands covering his where they rested against her cheeks. "And I love you," she replied, her voice strong and sure despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I love your patience and your kindness and the way you make me feel like I'm home for the first time in years." They held each other in the lamplight, 2 people who had started as strangers, bound by necessity, and discovered that the most profound love often grows not from passion alone, but from the courage to be truly known and the grace to love what is revealed. Outside their window, the first frost of autumn touched the edges of the oak leaves, marking the end of one season and the beginning of another, just as their own story was transforming from one of survival into one of hope. The winter that followed their revelations was the gentlest either had ever known, not because the weather was mild, but because they faced it together with hearts finally open to each other. Snow fell early and stayed late, wrapping their homestead in a hushed white silence that seemed to hold them apart from the rest of the world, creating a cocoon where their love could grow without interference or judgment. Every evening, after the chores were done and supper cleared away, they would sit by the fire with the primary or one of Catherine's treasured books. Thomas's voice grew stronger and more confident as he worked his way through increasingly complex words and sentences. His progress amazed them both. What had seemed impossible when he was hiding his ignorance became manageable when tackled with patience and encouragement. Catherine discovered that teaching someone she loved was entirely different from teaching the daughters of Boston society, that watching understanding dawn in Thomas's dark eyes was more satisfying than any praise she had ever received from headmistresses or parents. By Christmas, he could read simple stories aloud, his voice stumbling only occasionally over unfamiliar words, his finger no longer needing to trace beneath each line. By New Year's, he was writing letters to his sister Margaret, short but heartfelt notes that brought tears to Catherine's eyes when he read them aloud for her approval before sealing them in envelopes addressed in his own careful handwriting. But the lessons went both ways, though Catherine didn't realize it at first. As Thomas learned to decode the mysteries of written language, he taught her other things without either of them planning it. He taught her that love could be expressed through actions as much as words, through the way he always made sure the woodbox was complete before she woke each morning, through the wildflowers he brought her even in the depths of winter. hardy little blooms he found growing in sheltered spots where the snow couldn't reach them. He taught her that she was worth protecting, worth cherishing, worth the kind of quiet, steady devotion she had never believed she deserved. One evening in late February, as a blizzard howled outside their windows and they sat close together on the sofa, he had pulled near the fire. Thomas looked up from the book they were reading together and said quietly, "Catherine, there's something I want to ask you." She looked up from her needlework, noting the serious tone in his voice and the careful way he set the book aside, turning to face her fully. "What is it?" He was silent for a moment, his hands working restlessly against his thighs, and she recognized the nervous gesture from their earliest days together when he had been afraid to speak too much for fear of revealing his limitations. Now she knew it meant he was trying to find the right words for something important. "When we married," he began slowly, "it was an arrangement, a practical solution to practical problems. We both needed security, companionship, someone to share the work of building a life out here." She nodded, though something in his tone made her heart begin to beat faster, made her wonder where this conversation was leading. "But now," he continued, looking directly into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch, "now I want more than an arrangement. I want a real marriage, Catherine. Not just in name, but in truth. I want to be your husband in every way if you'll have me." The needlework fell from her suddenly nerveless fingers, her face warming at the implications of his words. They had been living as companionate spouses for 8 months, sharing a home and many intimacies of daily life, but sleeping in separate beds, both too careful of the other's boundaries to press for more than their practical agreement had specified. But love had changed everything, had created new hungers and desires that their original arrangement had never been meant to accommodate. She had been wondering herself how long they could continue their careful dance around the growing attraction between them. How long she could lie alone in her bed knowing he was just down the hall, wanting her but too honorable to assume her feelings matched his own. "Thomas," she said softly, reaching for his hands and holding them tightly in her own, "are you asking me to be your wife in truth? Because if you are, the answer is yes. 1,000 times yes." His face transformed, the careful control he maintained dissolving into pure joy and relief. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly. She could feel his heart racing against her cheek, could feel the tension leaving his body as her acceptance sank in. "I was so afraid," he murmured against her hair. "Afraid you would think I was taking advantage, assuming too much because of the affection we built. I never wanted you to feel obligated to anything more than what we originally agreed to." Catherine pulled back enough to look into his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the way love had made him brave enough to risk rejection for the chance of something deeper. "You could never take advantage of me," she said firmly. "Not when you've spent 8 months proving that you see me as a person worth respecting, worth caring for, worth loving for myself rather than what I can provide. I want this too, Thomas. Want to be yours completely, in every way that matters." The kiss that followed was different from any they had shared before, full of promise and intention, and the sweet relief of knowing that their feelings were matched and returned. When they finally parted, both flushed and breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "I want to do this right, Catherine. I want our first time to be special, not rushed or assumed, but chosen by both of us with clear hearts and minds. She smiled, her heart overflowing with love for this man who thought of her comfort and dignity even in moments of passion, who had never once made her feel like anything less than a precious gift to be treasured. "Then let's choose it together," she said softly. "Let's pick each other, completely and forever." They spent that night talking by the fire, making quiet plans and sharing deeper truths, preparing to cross the final bridge between the marriage they had built out of necessity and the love they were ready to build by choice. The storm outside raged on, but inside their home, they were warm and safe and finally, fully committed to the life they were creating together, word by word, touch by touch, heart by careful heart. Spring arrived with dramatic suddenness, as it often did on the prairie, transforming their world from winter white to vivid green, seemingly overnight. The creek swelled with snowmelt, wildflowers burst from the earth in impossible profusion, and the air rang with the songs of returning birds. Catherine stood in her garden, now expanded and flourishing under her careful tending, watching Thomas repair the fence that the winter storms had damaged. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his skin, no longer hunched with the shame of his secret, and she marveled at how much they had both changed in the months since that autumn morning when she had found Margaret's letter. They had grown into their love, she realized, the way plants grow toward light, naturally and inevitably, once the conditions were right. A shout from the direction of the main road drew her attention, and she looked up to see a rider approaching, dust rising behind his horse in the warm afternoon air. Thomas had seen him too, and was walking toward the house, his expression curious but not alarmed. Visitors were rare, but not unknown, and their remote location meant that anyone who made the effort to reach them usually had good reason. The rider resolved into a young man, perhaps 25, well-dressed, and riding a horse that spoke of money and careful breeding. He dismounted near their front gate with the effortless grace of someone accustomed to fine things, removing his hat as Catherine and Thomas approached. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the educated tones of the East Coast. "I'm looking for Mrs. Catherine Sullivan. I was told she might be living in this area." Catherine felt her blood turn to ice in her veins, her hard-won peace shattering like glass at the mention of her maiden name. No one had called her that in almost a year, and hearing it now, spoken by a stranger in front of her home, made her feel like her carefully constructed new life was nothing more than an illusion about to be stripped away. Thomas stepped slightly closer to her, not quite protective, but ready to be, his dark eyes fixed on the stranger with newfound wariness. "She's Mrs. Catherine Mueller now," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of steel that Catherine had never heard before. "May I ask your business with my wife?" The young man looked between them, clearly reassessing the situation, and Catherine saw the moment when he realized that whatever he had expected to find here, it wasn't a woman clearly settled in a loving marriage to a man who would defend her without question. "I'm James Whitmore," he said, his confidence faltering slightly. "I'm an attorney from Boston representing the estate of the late Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore." Catherine's legs nearly gave out beneath her, and only Thomas's sudden grip on her elbow kept her upright. Mrs. Whitmore had been the head mistress of the academy where she had taught, the woman who had been forced to dismiss her when the scandal broke, the woman who had written the letter of reference that had been Catherine's last connection to her old life. I'm afraid I don't understand, Catherine managed to say, her voice barely steady. Mrs. Whitmore passed away 3 months ago, Mr. Whitmore continued, his tone becoming gentler as he saw her distress. She was my great aunt, and she left instructions for me to locate you and deliver a message along with the bequest. She wanted you to know that she never believed the accusations against you were true, and she regretted that circumstance forced her to let you go. Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes, the validation she had never expected to receive washing over her like a benediction. Mrs. Whitmore had been a woman of rigid moral standards, and knowing that she had believed in Catherine's innocence, even when forced to act against her, felt like being given back a piece of herself she had thought lost forever. The bequest, Mr. Whitmore continued, reaching into his saddlebags and withdrawing a wrapped package, consists of some personal items she thought you might value, along with a sum of money she hoped would help you rebuild your life. He paused, looking uncertain, though it seems you've already done that quite successfully. Catherine took the package with trembling hands, feeling the weight of books within the wrapping, and suddenly she was crying in earnest, overwhelmed by the knowledge that someone from her past had remembered her with kindness, had thought her worthy of both forgiveness and generosity. Thomas's arm came around her shoulders, solid and comforting, and she leaned into his strength as she struggled to compose herself. "Thank you," she whispered to the young lawyer, "for finding me, for bringing me this. It means more than you could possibly know." Mr. Whitmore mounted his horse, clearly eager to be on his way now that his duty was discharged. Mrs. Whitmore also asked me to tell you that she hoped you had found happiness wherever your path had led you. Looking at you now, I believe she would be very pleased to know that you had. After he rode away, Catherine and Thomas sat on their front porch and unwrapped the package together. Inside were 3 of Catherine's favorite books from the Academy Library, volumes of poetry and literature that Mrs. Whitmore had somehow acquired, along with a letter in the headmistress's familiar handwriting and a bank draft for an amount that made Catherine gasp in astonishment. But more precious than the money or even the books was the letter, which contained not just Mrs. Whitmore's explanations and apologies, but something Catherine had never dared hope for: the truth about what had really happened with her supposed scandal. As she read aloud to Thomas, her voice growing stronger with each paragraph, Catherine learned that Mrs. Whitmore had conducted her own investigation after Catherine's departure, and had discovered that the married man who had claimed to love Catherine had fabricated the entire correspondence using her name and forged her handwriting to cover his own indiscretions when his wife became suspicious of his behavior. The real letters had been found after his death in a carriage accident, hidden in his office, and they revealed him to be a man who collected such tokens from multiple women, using them to create elaborate fantasies while destroying reputations and lives for his own amusement. Catherine had been entirely innocent of any wrongdoing, just as she had always claimed, and Mrs. Whitmore had spent her final years trying to track her down to deliver both vindication and apology. When Catherine finished reading, she and Thomas sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and paint their world in shades of gold and rose. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "You were always innocent," he said. "I recall the first time you shared your story with me. No woman with a heart as pure as yours could have done the things you were accused of." Catherine leaned against his shoulder, feeling the last of the shame and self-doubt that had driven her west finally lifting from her spirit like morning mist before the sun. "I know why," she said softly, "but it means everything to hear it told by someone who knew me then. Someone who believed in me even when she couldn't defend me." She looked down at the bank draft in her hands. Enough money to transform their simple homestead into something grand, to buy luxuries they had never dreamed of affording. "What shall we do with this?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "What would you like to do with it?" Catherine thought of their humble home, their simple life, their quiet happiness built from love and trust, and the daily choice to see the best in each other. She thought of the lessons they still shared by the fire each evening, the way Thomas's eyes lit up when he successfully puzzled out a particularly challenging passage, the way he had taught her that worthiness had nothing to do with social position and everything to do with the content of one's character. "I'd like to start a school," she said suddenly, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. "A real school for children out here who have no other way to learn to read and write. I'd like to teach again, but this time to teach children who genuinely need what I have to offer, regardless of their family's ability to pay." Thomas turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "It would mean people coming here regularly," he said. "Our privacy would be gone. Are you sure you want that?" Catherine smiled, thinking of how far they had both come from the frightened, secretive people they had been when they first met. "I'm not ashamed of our life anymore," she said. "I'm proud of what we've built together, proud of the love we found. I want to share some of that with others who might need hope the way we once did." Thomas kissed her temple, his lips warm against her skin. "Then we'll build a school," he said. "We'll make it together, just as we do with everything else." As the stars merged overhead and the night sounds of their homestead began around them, Catherine felt a deep contentment settle in her bones. The vindication from her past was precious, but not as precious as the future she and Thomas were planning together, nor as valuable as the love they had discovered in the process of learning to know each other honestly. They had found more than security in their arranged marriage. They had found partnership, acceptance, and the deep, abiding love that could weather any storm, built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and genuine understanding. The mail-order bride who had come west carrying shame and secrets had become a woman beloved and respected. And the man who had hidden his illiteracy had learned that his worth had never depended on his ability to read, but on the goodness of his heart and the strength of his character. Together, they had written a new story for their lives. One word at a time, one lesson at a time, one day of choosing love over fear at a time. And that story, they knew, was beginning. If this tale of unexpected love born from the darkest of circumstances touched your heart, if you believe that even in the harshest frontier towns, true love can bloom where least expected, then you've found your home with Maverick Hearts. Here we bring you more than just romance. We bring you the raw truth of survival, the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken, and the kind of love that rises from ashes to build something beautiful and lasting. If stories like this one stir something profound in your soul, if you hunger for more tales of redemption on the untamed frontier, make sure to show this story some love with a like. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another journey into the wild heart of the American West, where love was hard won but worth fighting for, And don't forget to hit that notification bell, because every week we're bringing you new stories of courage, passion, and the unbreakable human spirit that tamed the continent one heart at a time.